Have you heard of the Gospel of Judas? Or maybe not. If that's the case, it's likely that you find this idea quite strange, don't you? A gospel that connects with the antagonist of the plot, so to speak, compared to the more traditional gospels we know, right? Of the recognized gospels. However, there is indeed an ancient text titled the Gospel of Judas, which was already known even by the earliest generations of Christians. This document was discovered in an Egyptian cave in 1978, but only caught the public's attention in 2004, when a Swiss researcher presented it in Paris. During this period, the manuscript containing the Gospel of Judas was handled by various antiquarians and antique dealers, who tried to forcibly open the document. At first, it was quite deformed and had been hardened by the region's climatic conditions. These merchants tried to resolve the situation forcefully, applying pressure and alternating between freezing and thawing the object, for example. This resulted in the total loss of at least 10% of the text, possibly even 15%. It is important to mention that the Gospel of Judas, which was previously unknown, was part of a volume, that is, a collection of texts that included other writings, 3 of which were already known through other manuscripts that had been discovered earlier. These writings included the letter of Peter to Philip, the first apocalypse of James, as well as a text titled the Book of Allegenes or the Book of the Foreigner or even the Book of the Stranger. All these works were written in Coptic, which is a more recent version of the Egyptian language, which I have already mentioned in a video here on the channel, but initially, these texts were written in Greek. The manuscript itself was dated between the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. Just to remind you, as I mentioned earlier, there was a 2nd century Christian author, Irenaeus of Lyons, who had already spoken out about and opposed this gospel, known as the Gospel of Judas, which was disseminated among individuals he referred to as Gnostics. So, if the found document is indeed the Gospel of Judas that Irenaeus of Lyons knew, it would have been written between 150 and possibly before that. Now everything is fine, isn't it? What exactly does the Gospel of Judas contain? When this gospel was released, it quickly attracted enormous public attention, as it is something truly unusual, isn't it? A gospel that is linked to the apostle portrayed as a traitor in other gospels. When many people hear the mention of the Gospel of Judas, they tend to imagine that it is similar to the other gospels in the Bible, but presented from Judas's perspective. Therefore, it would discuss the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, just like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But in the interpretation of this particular apostle, right? Who knows? Maybe even explaining the reasons why he would have betrayed Jesus. However, what really happens in the Gospel of Judas is different from that. There are some aspects that resemble this, but it is not exactly the same thing. In fact, it is even more bizarre than that. First, because this gospel, known as the Gospel of Judas, is not a text that was attributed to Judas. It does not claim that Judas was the author of this gospel, nor that it is narrated by Judas. In fact, the text receives this title since Judas is the main character, alongside Jesus. He is the only one of the apostles whose name is mentioned in the text. He really appears in a different light, doesn't he? He is a character quite distinct from the one we find in the Gospels present in the current Bible. According to the Gospel of Judas, this apostle would have stood out from the other disciples and, more importantly, he would be the only one who truly understood the identity of Jesus and the true God. It is for this reason that, in the text, Jesus maintains a unique relationship with Judas, making revelations that are exclusive to him. Let's turn immediately to the manuscript, that is, the text of the Gospel of Judas, and examine how these secret revelations appear, what these revelations are, and how this unique relationship between Jesus and Judas is established. Therefore, the text begins with the following passage, the secret word of revelation that Jesus said to Judas Iscariot over the course of 8 days, 3 days before celebrating Passover. Is it true that everything written in the text happens exactly on those days, right? The text does not mention the birth of Jesus, his public preaching, his miracles, nor his crucifixion and resurrection. What he actually says are speeches that he reproduces, that is, speeches of Jesus that would have occurred a few days before Jesus' actual betrayal. Here, we will see that this betrayal is interpreted in a different way in this manuscript. Therefore, what really stands out in the text of the Gospel of Judas is what Jesus secretly reveals to Judas about his origin, the origin of Jesus, his identity, and his mission. And he begins the discussion on these matters after a rather intriguing scene that appears right at the beginning of the text. The text reports, "One day he, Jesus, was in Judea with his disciples and found them sitting and gathered, acting according to piety. As he approached his disciples, who were sitting together, giving thanks for the bread, he smiled. However, the disciples questioned him, "Master, why do you smile at our thanksgiving? What have we accomplished? This is what is considered right." He, Jesus, answered them and stated, "I am not laughing at you. You do not do this of your own will. On the contrary, it will be your God who will receive praise through this." So, they commented, "Right?" The disciples affirmed, "Master, you are the Son of God." Then Jesus asked them, "How do you know me? In truth, I tell you that no generation will recognize me among the people who are among you." What a mysterious answer, isn't it? Just like the entire Gospel of Judas and, in general, the proposal seems to be, essentially, that when Jesus observes the disciples expressing their gratitude for the bread, he considers it foolish and laughs, for by doing so, they would be thanking the Creator God. The Creator God mentioned in this text is not the true God. That is why he refers to God as your God, that is, your God, which is distinct from his God, who is the God of Jesus. The difference becomes evident when the apostles, upon hearing this, begin to get angry with Jesus and blaspheme. Then Jesus states the following, "Your God who is within you and his powers have become angry along with your souls. Who among you is strong enough to reveal the perfect human being to the light and stand before my face? No one is capable of doing that, right? No matter what it is, no one can accomplish it. Except Judas, who is the most unexpected disciple, isn't he? It is Judas Iscariot who stands before Jesus and declares, 'I know who you are and where you came from. You came from the eternal eon of Barbalu and from the one who sent you, whose name I am not worthy to pronounce.'" The text continues by stating that, upon realizing that Judas was expressing elevated thoughts, Jesus said to him, "Separate yourself from them, from the other disciples, and I will reveal to you the mysteries of the kingdom." It is from this point that some of Jesus' discourses about the immortal eons, the origin of everything, and how this world is not the creation of the true God, but rather of two inferior and imperfect entities, begin. How can we explain this, right? What is, in essence, the theology of the Gospel of Judas, or more precisely, what is its cosmogony? In what way does it describe the origin of the cosmos? How does this bring meaning to the things that exist out there, right? In the Gospel of Judas, Jesus describes the true God as the great invisible Spirit, whom no angel's eye has seen and no mind's thought has comprehended, and who has never been called by any name. Without quotes. According to this text, this being, who is the great invisible Spirit and the true God, resides in the infinite eon that existed before everything. Eon, in simple terms, refers to a divine dimension or a group of divine entities within that context. The meaning may differ in Gnostic texts, but, in essence, it is this. This great invisible and eternal Spirit, at a certain moment, generates a radiant cloud and, from this cloud, calls into existence a first assistant who will initiate the creation not only of our world but also of the oldest, purest, and most perfect entities. This first assistant is known as the self-originated or the one who generated himself, and in the text, he is referred to as the God of Light. It is from this being that four other beings emerge, and so on, right? Several generations emerge, right? And then, a figure appears called, which in other Gnostic texts is probably equivalent to the Elilut, a term that also appears frequently. This angel is created and he generates 12 angels, one of whom burns with fire on his face and is completely covered in blood. And this figure, who is quite frightening and has a sinister air, is known as Nebro, which means rebel. In the second text, he is also referred to by others as Yaldabaoth, a name that appears in various Gnostic writings. From this cloud, which gave rise to Nebro, other angels also emerge, including one called Sarklas. Sarklas states the following, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." Then, he creates the first human beings, Adam and Eve, based on the appearance of these angels, who are later, imperfect, and inferior emanations of the true God. Therefore, according to the perspective presented in this text, the creation of humanity, as well as the tangible and immediate world in which we live, would not have been carried out by the true God, but rather by beings of an inferior nature. Our reality does not match the true dimension of the true God, correct? However, the truth about Jesus is, and this is something Judas mentioned to Jesus at the beginning of this text, right? He states, "I know who you are and where you came from. You came from the immortal eon of Barbalu and from the one who sent you, whose name I am not worthy to pronounce." Therefore, Barbalu, who frequently appears in Gnostic writings, is probably the equivalent of the first luminous cloud mentioned in this text, from which the self-originated emanates. This being who sent Jesus, whose name he is not worthy to pronounce, is the great invisible spirit, who has never been known by any name. Therefore, the idea would be that people are immersed in an inferior reality, and Jesus' mission would be to save them from this condition, at least a part of them, so that they could return to their original essence, to the primordial, unique, and perfect being, who is the true God, their Father, and not Saklas, who is the deity that many believe to be the true God, but in reality is just an inferior entity that creates. What is Judas's role in this whole plot? Right? Judas would have a distinct task that, according to the text, would consist of making a sacrifice that surpassed that of the other apostles. What do you mean by that? Right? At the end of this gospel, Jesus says, "Truly, I say to you, Judas, those who offer sacrifice to Saklas." And then there is a gap in the text, where everything that is evil is mentioned, but you will surpass them all, for you will sacrifice the human being who carries me. In other words, delivering Jesus to death, or rather, delivering the human being that is Jesus, that is, his human aspect, not the divine, to be executed is considered an appropriate sacrifice in accordance with the will of the true God. It is what initiates the redemptive work of Jesus and the defeat of the forces that govern our lower world. And this sacrifice performed by Judas, in which Jesus clarifies that this betrayal is, in fact, a sacrifice that is pleasing to him, contrasts with the devotional practices of the apostles and the thanksgiving they were offering while breaking the bread. In fact, according to the Gospel of Judas, this type of practice is only pleasing to Saklas, who is the creator of the world and responsible for the production of bread and other material needs. When Judas understands this, Jesus addresses him with the following words, "Right? Observe, everything has already been revealed to you. Lift your eyes and observe the cloud and the light that resides within it, as well as the stars that surround it. The star that guides the way is your star." Judas raised his eyes and saw the resplendent cloud, then entered it. Those who were on the ground heard a voice coming from the cloud, saying, "There is a gap in the text, the great generation, gap, image, gap, and gap, right." The text, unfortunately, has many gaps in this section, probably due to the well-intentioned but clumsy efforts of some antiquarians who tried to restore the manuscript before it was handed over to more qualified professionals. Anyway, even in the sections where the text is complete, it is already complicated to understand what is really being communicated, isn't it? For example, in this last section, when the text mentions that he entered the luminous cloud, who is this he? Is it Judas, in the spiritual dimension, as if he had been accepted by the true God or something similar? Because, surely, it is not in a literal or physical way, right? As if he had been abducted by aliens. For Judas, further along in the text, approaches the priests and hands over Jesus, consummating the betrayal that, in fact, was part of his mission. That he in the passage can also refer to Jesus. I believe this interpretation makes more sense, especially the idea that Jesus, being divine, would have returned to his place of origin from that point and left only his non-divine manifestation, right? The person who carried Jesus, as mentioned in the text, so that he could be crucified. In summary, the text as a whole is truly complex and challenging to interpret, and this is due to several reasons, including the fact that it is directed at a community that is based on secrets and personal revelations that should not be widely known or understood by everyone. Thus, it is possible that some readers of this gospel possess certain keys that help them better understand what the author really wanted to convey, beyond the appearances of the text, the images, the metaphors, and the allegories present in the work. Thus, some members of the community that produced the text, as well as those who read it, had access to information that helped them decipher, interpret between the lines, and fill in the gaps that we can no longer identify today. In any case, it is evident that this text is a work clearly originating from some ancient Gnostic group, right? Possibly, this refers to the group of Christians known among historians as the 7 Years, who had quite specific doctrines. This title of 7 years, it's not like 7 years as in 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, it's 7 years like Set, as in the proper name Set, because it refers to the doctrine contained in the texts of this group that divides humanity into races or types. And among them is the lineage of Seth, which is the archetype, the spiritual pattern related to Adam's third son, named Seth. There is Cain, Abel, and Seth, but the Seth that refers to the 7 years is not, strictly speaking, the carnal human being who is Adam's third son, but rather his representation, his archetype, on a higher plane, etc. Only this lineage of 7, according to the 7 years, would be considered complete and fully saved, right? There is a positive destiny that also applies to other individuals known as psychics, but the destiny that is truly favorable, which implies the return to the great invisible spirit, is reserved exclusively for this grand generation, the perfect generation. There are various titles that are attributed to this group of people who identify as descendants of the seven. This subject is, in fact, addressed in other texts by different groups that are also considered Gnostic, such as the Valentinians. However, we will reserve this discussion for another video, as the classification of these Gnostic groups and the precise definition of what they are generate intense debates among contemporary historians. Proceeding, in other Gnostic writings, as well as in the Gospel of Judas, there is a recurring theme: the revelations that are made exclusively to one or a few disciples, who are distinguished from the main group. This probably served to establish a clear opposition to other Christian groups, especially the one we now know as Orthodox Christianity, in quotes, since the notion of orthodoxy, which refers to correct doctrine, is something that each group claims to be orthodox, right? Thus, what we currently know as Christianity, which is based on the Gospels that are in the Bible, was a group that the Gnostics probably were, and that opposed them. Therefore, they claimed that the apostles did not understand anything Jesus said. Just as Christians and Orthodox adhere to the doctrine of the apostles, they are also misinformed about what they believe they know, aren't they? Have no idea what they are discussing. Those who truly possess the true knowledge, which was revealed by Jesus, are indeed those who follow the teachings that were transmitted secretly, for example, to Mary Magdalene, to Judas, and other characters who appear in apocryphal Gospels, that is, those not included in the Bible. Moreover, the issue of the complex origin of all things, which arises from a perfect being and unfolds into a series of emanations that progressively become more distant from perfection, is undoubtedly a very characteristic aspect of Gnostic texts. This, for example, can be found more fully in the secret Gospel of John, which is the Apocryphon of John. And this cosmogony, or cosmology, as you prefer, which explains the origin of the world and its functioning, is directly related to Platonic or Neoplatonic philosophical currents, which were quite influential at the time, right? But let's leave this topic for another video to avoid bringing more complications, where we can explore, for example, the secret Gospel of John and also the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which I mentioned earlier, and perhaps create a specific video about Gnosticism. For now, that's all. However, if you are interested in exploring other apocryphal texts, I have already discussed the Gospel of James and the Infancy Gospel of Thomas here on the channel. Therefore, here's a tip to watch in the indicated order. And, as usual, I immensely thank you for watching.